Hi, this is Mr. Guy, and we're going to be talking about the executive branch and the presidency. This is chapter 14 in our book. This is just supplemental information. I want you to do the Prezi. That's going to be the first, but this is going over the chapter and going over the study guide with that. So hopefully it'll help out. So we're now going to compare the president and parliamentary systems, which is very interesting because remember the presidential system, there's three branches of government. In the parliamentary system, there's only two. Presidents may be outsiders. Prime ministers are always insiders, part of the party that won. They're chosen by the members of the majority party in parliament. In the presidential system, they are not chosen by the members of the majority party. Presidents have no guaranteed majority in the legislature. Prime ministers always have a majority. And divided government. That the definition is one party controls the White House and another controls one or both houses of Congress. So even if there is a president is in the Senate and the presidency, because the House there is divided government. So the Electoral College is how we choose the president. Almost all states, that's 48 out of 50, use a winner take all system. If no candidate wins a majority, that's 270, the House would decide the election for the president. The Senate would decide the vice president. The Electoral College ultimately worked differently than expected because the founders did not anticipate the role of political parties. Typically, in the beginning, person that was first was the president, person that was second was vice president, and that didn't work with political parties. The first presidents, the office was legitimized by men active in the independence and founding politics. Many of them were involved in the Revolution and the Articles of Confederation in the Constitutional Convention. Minimal activism of early government contributed to lessening the fear of the presidency. So George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams didn't do a lot of activism. They just followed what the Constitution had, so they lessened the fear of the presidency. Relations with Congress was reserved, few vetoes, no advice from Congress to the president. Actually, George Washington actually went to the Senate to actually get some advice, and they let him sit outside in the outside of the Senate and didn't talk to him, so he left and never came back. And in the beginning, there was very, very few vetoes. Powers of the president. The potential for power is ambiguous in the clauses. Power as commander in chief, what does that actually mean? The duty to take care of laws to be faithfully executed, executive power. Greatest source of power lies in politics and public opinion, the bully pulpit. There is the power to persuade. Presidents try to transform popularity into congressional support for their programs. President coattails have had a declining effect for years. That's the president winning an election and then getting congressmen and senators to get elected because they were popular. So that's in presidential elections 2020, 2024, and so on. So if President Trump wins re-election, will he have coattails where he will have a majority in the House and in the Senate? Popularity is affected by things beyond their control. Consider Bush's approval ratings follow September 11th, the 2008-2009 crash, and even right now with the coronavirus. What happens is beyond President Trump's control. So if you look at this slide, you'll see at the beginning of the term, they're at the highest, and then it goes down to the lowest at the end of their term. That's from Truman. Eisenhower was pretty consistent, but he was still a little bit lower. Kennedy passed away, didn't finish a term, but his was lower. Johnson went way, way down. Most of that was due to the Vietnam War and what he did. Nixon, of course, did pretty well in his first term. He did have a dip, but then his second term dropped and he actually resigned. And you look at there's Ford, Carter, and Reagan. There's Bush, Clinton. Clinton went actually up for a little bit until after he was impeached, and then went down. And then G.W. Bush had major, major problems. So you can see presidential popularity normally happens in the beginning of the term, and then it goes down. Presidential victories and votes in Congress, and then this is from 1953 to 2002. And you can see the percentage and then the years. Take a look at that. Now, the White House office is the president's helpers, people he chose from his party or from his reelection. Um, Power is wielded by those people who are in the room when a decision is made. So, all those people that were in the room with President Obama during the killing of Osama bin Laden, they were seen as more powerful than those outside of the room. The pyramid structure is the typical structure. Most assistants report through a hierarchy to the chief of staff, who then reports to the president. Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, late in his administration, used the pyramid structure. So this is in the White House staff. There's the circular structure. Cabinet secretaries and assistants report directly to the president. Carter did this early in his administration. Then there's the ad hoc structure. Task force and committees and informal groups deal directly with the president. Clinton did that in his beginning terms. So these are different types of structures of the White House office. Typically, the most popular one is the pyramid structure, where the pyramid goes with the president, then the chief of staff, and then through that. And then this is the growth of the White House staff from 1945 to 2002, and it's gone way up since Franklin Roosevelt, with the total executive office, and then going down to about 2,000 people. And then the White House staff has been pretty consistent since 45 all the way to 2002. So you see the total executive office has gone up and is a lot bigger, and the White House staff is small. Cabinet is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but the idea that the president will actually pick department heads was specifically said. Presidents have to make many more appointments to make than do prime ministers due to competition created by separation of powers. President control over departments remains uncertain. Secretaries become advocates for their department. Do they work for the president or do they work for the department? That's a big question to ask. And there are those cabinet departments, which is like the Department of Defense, uh, Department of Justice, the Agriculture, Homeland Security, and so on. These are the different cabinet departments when they were created. So the earliest was Secretary of State, or Department of State, Department of Treasury. Department of Defense was 1947. It used to be the Department of War. Department of Justice, 1789. Agriculture was pretty old, 1889. And then you have the approximate employees out of 2000. Department of Defense has 673,500, so it's always the biggest. Look at Veteran Affairs, 220,000. Obviously, you have those that deal with hospitals, nurses, and so on like that. Homeland Security is one of our newest ones, probably the newest one, and that's got a lot of employees and it's growing. Character. Kennedy was seen as bold, articulate, amusing leader, improviser who bypassed traditional lines of authority. Then you have Nixon, who was an expertise in foreign policy, disliked confrontation, tried to centralize power, tried to control power. So he was one of the first with the imperial presidency. Then you have Reagan, who set policy priorities, then gave staff wide latitude. He was leader of public opinion. He was the big delegator. He decided the main area where they were going to go, and then people were delegated to do the job. Clinton was a good communicator, pursued liberal centrist policies. He was pretty much more central than liberal. G.W. Bush ran a tightly run White House. Agenda became dominated by foreign policy after 9/11 attacks. And he was one that basically tried to control the agenda. The veto power. Veto message sent within 10 days of the bill's passage. Sometimes it can actually be done beforehand, and the president can say, I'm going to veto this bill if you actually pass it. Pocket veto, only before Congress adjourns at the end of the session. So you've only got 10 days, and they send the bill over 8 days, and then the Congress basically adjourns before that. So it's just a pocket veto. Congress rarely overrides vetoes. It's very rare that it's done because it takes 2/3 of both House and Senate to actually override the veto. So it takes 67 votes to do that. President does not hold item line veto power. The Supreme Court said no. Twice they've tried to give it to the president, especially Republicans who like it quite a bit. And it does make sense to do it. And I do think it's possible to actually get an item line veto passed through the states and through the Congress, but it hasn't been done. The president's program Resources in developing a program include interest groups, aides, campaign advisors, federal departments, agencies, and specialists. Constraints include the public, congressional reactions, limited time and attention, unexpected crises. So these are programs like the New Deal, the New Federalism, um, and you might have the Great Society would be a program. Only 14 of 41 presidents, and actually now there are 45 presidents, have served for 2 terms. George W. Bush will be the 15th if he finished, and then Barack Obama was 16. So typically, you've got basically, I think it's right now, 17 presidents have finished 2 terms. And we'll see if President Trump does 2 terms right now. 8 vice presidents have taken office upon the president's death. Um, the vice president prior to 2000, only 5 vice presidents won the presidency and election without having been first entered the office as a result of their president's death. So it's not one of those things where we look at as a VP to be the next president. We'll see if President Trump's Vice President Pence will actually win when President Trump is done. We'll see if Joe Biden wins. In that case, after Obama, it wasn't right after. We'll see if that happens. Vice President presides over the Senate and votes in only cases of ties. 25th Amendment in 1967 determined what happens if the president is disabled, what happens if the president has surgery, what happens if the president is ill. Illness is decided by the president, by vice president and cabinet, or by 2/3 vote. So it could be determined by the president. It could be determined by the vice president and the cabinet, or by the vice president and 2/3 votes of Congress. The new vice president must be confirmed by a majority of both houses. This is one case where the House of Representatives actually votes on confirming something. So that was like where Gerald Ford was voted. He was the VP nominee for President Nixon, and he was chosen and then was voted on by the House and Senate. And then you also have Nelson Rockefeller was chosen by Gerald Ford, and he was voted on in that way. Impeachment. Indictment by the House, they bring the charges. Conviction by the Senate, they're the jury. Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, he was not impeached. Nixon was not impeached. He had resigned before the charges were actually voted on. Bill Clinton was impeached, and then President Trump was impeached. Johnson, Clinton, and Trump were not convicted. Neither Johnson or Clinton was convicted by the Senate, neither was President Trump. Constraints on the president. Both the president and the Congress are constrained due to many things, complex issues, scrutiny of the media, greater number and power of interest groups from the NRA to the National Organization of Women, or might be the Teachers Union. So these are the constraints on the president. So this was a short overview of the presidency. This is chapter 14. And if you have any questions, feel free to post. And this is something just to be supplemental information for you to understand about interactions among the branches. This is the president and the executive branch.